Shantideva, you do Bodhisattva, Yeshi.
Tung. Okay, we have still 6 minutes. Yes. We recite 21 Tara one time. Oh. Everybody open the Green Tara book, page 1 and 2. Ryan. Okay. Again, independent. Which refuge in the four immiscible thoughts, yes. One time English, one time Vietnamese.
Dạ đấy, rồi mình chuyện đó mình tụng quy phát Bồ Đề tâm tư một lần tiếng Anh, một lần tiếng Việt, một lần tiếng Tạng. in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Heart's assembly. Until I am enlightened, I take refuge from the virtuous merit that I collect by practicing giving and other perfections. May I attain the state of a Buddha to be able to benefit all sentient beings. May all sentient beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all sentient beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May all sentient beings not be separated from the happiness that is without suffering. May all sentient beings abide in equanimity, free from attachment and hatred for those held close and distant. Cho đến khi đạt đến giác ngộ, đệ tử xin quy y Tam Bảo, Phật, Pháp và Tăng, nương nhờ công đức hạnh bố thí ba la mật và các ba la mật khác. Đệ tử xin nguyện đạt đến giác ngộ để cứu độ mọi chúng sinh. Xin nguyện cho mọi chúng sinh an lành và tạo nhân để được an vui. Xin nguyện cho mọi chúng sinh giải thoát khỏi khổ đau và tiêu trừ các nhân tạo khổ đau. Xin trừ cho mọi chúng sinh không lìa an vui, tức là không phải chịu khổ đau. Xin nguyện cho mọi chúng sinh an trụ trong hạnh xả, không chấp thủ và sân hận đối với những chúng sinh chấp thủ xa gần. Sangha cho tăng cho kỳ cho nam la chẳng chung ba du đa ni kẹp su chi đa ghi jin so ghi bê so nam ghi rô la bên cho sang ghi ru ba su Sam chen tam chen de wa tang de wei chu tang dan ba chu chi Sam chen tam chen du ngao tang du ngao chi chu tang ro wa chu chi Sam chen tam chen du ngao me ben de wa tang mi de wa chu chi Sam chen tam chen ni re cha tang ni tang de wei tang non la ne ba chu chi.
Okay, page 43, the mandala offering.
143 cúng dường Mandala.
Shingam biwa ishu om benzam burme om
Zang Shin
No balance Luta lupa Ngaya dang Shin Yun dalam jo Rimbo Pasangi Shin De Chepa Name Bae Loto Kolo Rimboche Novo Rimboche Sumo Rimboche Lembo Rimboche Lambo Rimboche Tajo Rimboche Mabe Rimboche Tenche Pumba Gema Chewama Loma Garman Bendoman Dupaman Rasama Chijaman Niman Dawa Rimboche Ruo Chole namba yewe genzen usuladam bi penjo puson soba matsawa mewa tsanshi yidwa tela chinjen tsa Gyewa jebe pande lama tamba namda kewa doya yongi gewe shenye chenpo gen rinpo chen shengani ba chimbe sunje samo shuye yendo shingambe wa ke won
这
tuje
种
Okay. Anzai Shenbe Ge Chon Sheme Loi Chon Re
啊，
Oye, está. Ya lo ven chendar con besón le va. Oh, tiene casa, pero chi bene. Chidar lang burwa, chidar lang bu. Kese bu kane chung ba yi sera. Sang ga, sang kam ga. Ne casa. Chita Lambu Tungsa Kane Tumba Yeshi. Oh, Chita Lambu Tungsa Kane Tumba Ye. Kangala ne Yini Chajurba. Kangala ne Yini Chajurba. Tene Karsara. Oh, Tene Yeba Truba Meba. Yandu Lunga Darshira. So Enji Tenden Deba Tedan Rasa. Oh, she Sumbatara. In a Pechan Sungudwa. Lambu Yina Lambu Tuina Chiro, Lambu Chi. And the young Sarbo Chilia Yete. Nico Satisago, some Satella Shenji Chane, Nizati Saga and Doresa. But into the young Sonsako, Sadi Samaduche, Yeba the tomato Geshe-ma, young Luni, and it doing Yadu Resura. Petition to Sungora. Marazo Mezzi di Soya Tandasura, Soya Jigane. Sending Jibu Tandalia, Raya Buchi Yongo do some de Roa, Benjo Yabuchi Tukudu some. And the Shala Sawachene, saw the young double saw members of Logbe saw at Tibasan, Miller Condo, Naja, Trado, Dreswiche, and it Benjo Mambusaga Nasura. He saw an encouragement, Gavachima, Nason, do Loya, to the Sata Yoresura. And it Gavachima, so Punguchane, Nason do Londo des. Oh, Tendre, Najum Hajavach Cordes on Gudwa.
So here, as it's taught by the Master Chandra Goman, he gives this example of like an elephant who is hungry. He wants a few mouthfuls of grass, and seeing some grass sort of at the edge of a well or something that is really steep, out of his attachment to wanting that little bit of grass, going after that, he falls into this great abyss. And so neither does he get the grass that he wanted, and also finds himself in a terrible sort of situation. And so here, in the same kind of way, using this example, if we just pursue the kind of affairs of this life, just thinking about sustaining ourselves and really pursuing like getting wealth and a good reputation and so forth, and in the course of pursuing that, we engage in things like we have anger and we're competitive and jealous with others. We think we're getting what we want, but instead we're creating the causes for suffering in our future lives. So like this elephant that sees these mouthfuls of grass and thinks, oh, I'm going to get something good, but instead falls into this great abyss, so too is it when we pursue the affairs of solely this life, thinking that we're getting something good. We're really creating the causes to be in a great abyss, our future ruin in the future, our loss in the future.
Oh, yeah. Oh, the Dukas or Tangaran to Tandaka, Sungurasana. Metsy de Togor Bangajo. Metsy de Toa Sondako, Sayatung, Equate, Service Coche, Goyorwa. Oh, the Tandale Levache would have Sudap Sura. Sudap Soya Jet on Dala. Oh, the Soya Jet, the young dog saw and the young dog saw Sigra. Metsy Soya saw the young dog saw Jewers. Young dog saw and Shella Toa Jenny. Benjo Truba, Shella never send the Benjo Truba. Rawa, Lumbe Timber in the Benjo Truba Soba, or the Nishi Yoma, kitchen and lock with order. Or tea in a tea, Drebutelia, Nikiwa Chimba Soso, yes, only Kiola Soba, no mean Devin Young good days on Gora. This was a good city. The oil air to Dalia, so the Saya to go to the manor, they come in Gura. Kangi Tambu the Karas, Benjo, maybe coming to this on the Sanjig. Chimba Tambu Tongure Songudwa, a Chimbe launches, Sedelia, social duties in the Chimbatan Chabura, Chimbangos, Taya Manaya, me Chimbatan, the Chesu Rancho Wada. The general today would occur similar Chimbutan Dana. John Jay social labona de chick charging in the military country those pasha. Yatin Morote on some other suited to the Chabu de Singudwa, Losatalia. Today, the Cochunjuji in a costoya and all to this music Chimbaton Atona, on all at this you and to the Chesa Chegura, some sort of Tidana, don't send piggy order. Ngobura chi na tibe shibaji sosunyamdo kadi ne nyade suru samlta jo mara te senna chimbusigora longche ya samlta sosu choya de tira sosu ga longche mele longche petona ni choya tabra di mena ko di peche na yogdo kaje long ma chene sosu che mata mele te mata na zambuling ri kanga se yin sam ramti kanga nge yin sam de na diri chere samba kiura che digi yana sigora oti sonza tanga zo meze ke dande 내가 맞이 쓰고 말아 가셔서도 당배 최셔도 어떤 마음다서 원래 대치소나
Khi chúng ta để muốn tồn tại
So here for us, we have to survive. We have to support ourselves, and in order to live, we have to have things like food and clothing and shelter. And so we need to have a livelihood, a way of supporting ourselves in order to be able to get those things that we need. But we should do so with the right kind of livelihood. And right livelihood means acting in such a way as we're not sort of cheating others, harming others in order to accomplish our wealth, breaking the law in order to get that wealth. We should instead not just be sort of thinking about this life and this aims alone, this life's aims alone, but rather we should be thinking about sustaining ourselves in the right sort of a way. And so here the first kind of difficulty that we have to overcome is poverty. If we are completely impoverished and have nothing, it's very difficult to pursue mental development. So the Buddha first talked about developing our generosity, learning to be able to give away without kind of stinginess or attachment. And so we have to have wealth to live. We need to have those kinds of necessities in order to survive. And thereby we're encouraged to develop generosity. Generosity is the cause for future wealth. And so we have these kinds of stories of people who are like really stingy, who aren't able to give things away. They get really attached. They can't even like use those things. Or on the other hand, people who engage in so much generosity that the second they have something, they're actually thinking about, where do I give this away to? Who can I give this to? And so we can see that we should really try to develop that kind of generosity wherein we're willing to part with anything and not having that great attachment.
최시대 삼로 코트에 요마래 소소 커두 강에 대해서 했던다. 어디 손자 고 벤처디 고요라. 뒤 손자 내가 제고요라. 이 배전에 송구도 다시 침변도 나려. 다시 뭐 근데 세월에서 사주 산질 수도 당보달이야. 하다말라 년고자 부다 충마 제수제 메테바일레메 되니 초우 다시 소세. 얼른 낭미네 전고투스 남육간주 잠바다 세와서야 돼. 처음에 봐서야 돼. 공디서 당보 소수 타니에서네 쪽도. 엔터넷 자셔서 봤다고요라. 어디나를 송구도 내가 제 창고를 해서 밀패야가 소리 보이나다 가리네 리베네 나가네 미치서 내가 그거 가야 있는다 알아. 된지 가리네 내가 전고 잡고래서 거래서 이는 그 낭밀이야 강에 용마로 소하다 지르서 존내 뛰고요라. 이던데 내가 제고라. 아이네 대치도자 야와로 시베지 고기 삼사때 아니 밀이야 고마고야다 팀하게야다 밀에 차와체네다 소체네다 소화된데 두고 되나 근데 내가 배치 대회에서도 저한테 풀을 소소 껴와 치마다 체대니가 경험하고라 메시디야 고지게는 체딜에 끼바용 거라 메시디 득바지게는 체를 소화체 공동가제 차도 디펜저 두게 있던데 체디 사야 통에 니들 와시다 제게 엄마 기도하니 엄마라 뒤던데 이버사지 엄마를 쓴 거라 지다고 론주 제고를 생각도 리베네 응알을 정성도 아카시에서 뜻은도 딜레가 맞지 따가지고 급급리하고 제바된데 공기업 소수 집고 쪼시 제고에 고급이 왔다. 그래서 지다 미인의 자주 선발이야 소리벌을 높순 것도 와. 자주 선발 소리벌 높세. 배전할 때도 여기도 와. 자주 그 심지게 사소나 아니 창도 라로에 대해서 자주 선발의 창통계 여기서 라로게 여기서라. 뒤걸려야 그 교폐지 되그랬어. 그래서 코란 몇세 코란데 샴페인 던다도 샴을 쳐봐야 했던다 바탕사로. 얘도 그 개와 요용 받고 저거래 니쿠 되나 그 매주 초에도 니쿠요라 클라사 되기나 또 강가 개와래 그거라 어디 아주 된데 맞잖아 매주 되게 돈다 빼줘 또 저기 돈다려 샤라 쳐와체 이번단 제배 거네 롱주 사이드 치료 말해서 거라 대전에 개와치마 난데 계산들 경찰 개와치마라 그래서 얘도 가라 좀 매주 개다데 시라이 개첨부들에 벤저 같이 존나 고고로 라레 고그레 남미는 남미 김자레 고그레 농벌에 야제도 그래 고 가가 내가 돼 제거라 내가 제대 개발은 유래 시고도 현리 지존 팬도 시고라 그 정말 내가 전 정말 밀 거고 세지 관계요라 수술라지 랭기 something 저 주기와 말아 라테 그 선부치 때도 날랭겨라 진짜 기회니 오마도 어디서도 고 내가 지나 라렘바데 소유 오마로 라렘베 좀 체크스르메 챤라 팽그레 삼사 치소 아리네 싱가 답기는데 강가 소리 벌로럽스도 챤기 고고 강세거라 내가 고야 내가 강에서 했던다려 이때에 주로 어디 인도 공간 좀 메시지해야 돼 야보시게 내가 제도 강가 야보시 디고다 만들을 내가 인게 디치도자 소소 삼반남다 제제 밀레 팽기 지소를 팽베 내가 인 삼나 니 가리네 소리 벌리네다 맨 챔비네다 켈럽이네다 강가 개발에 유르투에도 와 네가 저 이지미지 삼다고도 초답대 초답 자고 그래 초답을 배고 그래 뒤치소를 팽바치다 어딘데치도 삼르다마도 단대 때에서 지라에 좀달이야 니 개와치마랑 동행 연구는 만들어 어디 계신 부치세 양답에 초아 양답에 나스 양답에 레지 타승도 연구도 와 어디 계신 부치 쓰고도 와 해드리지래
So here, if we're in a really difficult kind of a state, like we're impoverished or we're hungry, like a hungry ghost or something, we don't have the kind of thought of doing the Dharma. So we need to have the things necessary to alleviate that kind of temporary suffering that we experience in our lives. Those kinds of like hunger and thirst and the needs that we have need to be met in order to be able to think of the Dharma. And so here, it really begins with having the kind of attitude of supporting oneself in a right way. And so there are these verses of auspiciousness, beginning with the sort of like we should have respect for the family, and parents should take care of their children in a way that is right livelihood. So here, the kind of study of the various things like the five sciences, like the crafts or medicine or language and so forth, these are all sort of ways that we can provide for the needs of society while still providing for ourselves as well. If instead we try to pursue like our own happiness alone and really thinking about just getting things for this life, we're willing to deceive others and sort of cheat them, get angry with them, lie to them, and so forth. Maybe we're temporarily thinking that we're gaining some kind of benefit, getting something good, but really, it's going to bring us bad in this life as well as in the future. So when we are motivated by anger and jealousy, competitiveness, stinginess, our kind of attachment, we aren't going to have a good outcome from that. So some upon hearing the teachings of the Buddha think that it's being advocated that we just sort of relinquish everything and go stand out in the wilderness or don't have any sort of possessions. But there is the kind of need for learning these various sciences. We can't sustain ourselves or our society without having things like the various crafts and medicine and language and so forth. And so by doing these kinds of activities with a bodhicitta attitude all becomes virtue. If someone really has generated bodhicitta, it's said that like even if they were say drunk, their virtue would increase. Like in Shantideva, we see the line about bodhisattvas even while sleeping they are developing virtue. So even if we're not at that point where we have kind of spontaneous bodhicitta all the time, to have that kind of wish to create benefit, that is going to bring us profit in the short term as well as in the future. That's what's going to give rise to that kind of long-term benefit. And so we need to do work. We need to have the kind of things that we need to sustain ourselves. But we should do this kind of work with the attitude of wanting to be beneficial to society, for thinking about how this can be of benefit to others. We shouldn't just do it for our paycheck to get the money that we need and not think about anything else. When we're just thinking about that, we're willing to do non-virtuous actions in order to get that. But if we are thinking about the benefit of others, we're creating the kind of causes for happiness in the future. We will gain benefit now, but also in the future. And so knowing things like medicine and language and so forth, these are very important. We have to be able to support ourselves, to be able to take care of our needs, to be able to do Dharma. But we shouldn't just do those activities for that temporary benefit of getting what we need, but instead should have an attitude of using those to benefit others. And so when we talk about things like right livelihood and right speech and right action, it's really having this kind of bodhicitta attitude, or at least the thought of wanting to be beneficial to others, not harm them in any way. It's very important that we have the kind of livelihood that isn't harmful to others, and we pursue it in a way where we are really thinking with an altruistic attitude.
Chima Page to that the Chew sometime, Chima Page to that the Geshe-ma or the Duca soda. Cindy Mezi, Yea to Dalia. It was on a Cindy Mezi Koran to Dali, it was such a sort of my imbache. Mezi Soya to Dal. Yan Tibu service of which is thought you would remember. Chendilla Dewa, who's a pember soda, she said. Chendilla Ra Dewa, Shan Dewa, Jamba the Sawada, Kontunga, Tradola Soba Kanchun Cheshire. What you did message care to Dalia, it was a rangaja. You are Chimachi with some Tibusayo Mara, the message they could get to it, the Kanka quoted. Message care to Dalia, the saw. It was Charlotte Sawach and Maimaro, Charlotte Sawach and the Sap and also Devina. Nick Yochimang has only Kiriva, how the military to the Swapang River. What did they say? And it said the Langaja, Trado, some Tikanja, Yamusha Chimbuchan and the Quakos Degra, Kondungaja, Trato and Similar Sopa, some Tami Tomba Yeshe to Tishego, Nanga, some round of Shibujipe. You have now of Shaja, Tibasaga, and those who conjure Yungura, Shikan get the name Guda. What here the Konga, some of the shits in Bushida Mayage, Chunju Cherwa. I said, should I send a message to Darwa? What you do, Mada, Mayesiata, Kondo, Tangaja, Trato to the Kanyu Jena, and then you more Payag, Shitsuda, Tarbato say, call it 10 to Tare, Tarbatu, Chuludo. Yes, social Chanya membership, social la Trinche, Pama Pinche la Sopa, Sasan la Soba, Pudula Soba, Gigan la Soba, Karina Randa, Rana Katin Chimbu Majeva Simjan Diche, Omar Simbujichi, Omar. Yonachi Pun and Omar Shimbatochi, Kawaka Tandamarato, and they can't kill Amadua Karkari, Akwe Omaro, the Tamjelia. You Samje, Rana Katin Chimbu, the Rana Doya, but said the Pamanashi, Yaudesha. In the Marin, the Yabum Tinkam to say Mavisonza. Samalia, Tene, Weda Treach to Legacy to Genki, Sanji Kovato Basha, Samsa. So Sutanja catch on my ba. And then Namsa Chetu Mana or Mambanga, some jet Tamjel trip to Geshe some. Yet and Dali, Canary in a pan. Yandenari in a Changi in some, and it Tamje say, Yanden Tamje song a concise in Yursona, and the Shalia. And don't never than them but to get over all tender. Jetungue Saji Komanchi Tobarsha, Tito be Tapcho to Cubati, Junjunal Sonshabe. Nitabe Chambata, Nijile Shichen, Tabe Shanchi, Chaju Sem. And then your more Tamjeg, Zawapa, Chombeg, 다음에 또 봐. 다음에 배 동반이 송벌이야. 퇴바시. 아니 소소 삼루다. 삼루다네 아버지 자를 쳐서는 야네 야도 공부지. 뒤던달을 치시고 인삼 꿀로세 때문에 셈버쇼세요. 야, 그래.
So this life is not very long. When we think about the duration of this life and the rebirths that we will take in the future is much longer. If it were the case that we were to remain stably, we were able to remain without kind of changing, then that would be different. But we obviously don't have such a life. So it is for the affairs of just this life that we do non-virtuous actions. The Dharma, doing the Dharma is what brings happiness in this life, as well as benefit in future lives. It brings happiness for us and others, as well as benefits in our future lives. So here we do negative actions when we're thinking about only this life alone. When we are pursuing just those types of things, we engage in non-virtues, wanting to get them. We do acts that are harmful to others and thereby create the cause for rebirth in the lower realms. And when we are driven by our various afflictions, our anger and our jealousy, our competitiveness and our pride, when we have this kind of thought of my side and them, us and them, and that kind of bias and like clinging to our own side, this here is that what we are talking about in terms of selflessness is the antidote to that kind of grasping at an I and a mine. And it is from those kinds of attitudes, our afflictive emotions, that we are creating the causes for our continued cycling and suffering in samsara. So by getting rid of those, by seeing the faults in them and trying to remove them, we are setting this kind of foundation for liberation, for being able to get out of this cycle of suffering. And we also can recognize that it's not just us that is in this suffering situation, but all of those that we love, our parents, our relatives, our husband, wife, our teachers, those around us who we care about, actually all sentient beings, because there isn't a single sentient being who hasn't acted in this capacity, showing great kindness, caring for us, like with the kind of kindness that the parents of this life cared for us with. It's just a matter that we don't recognize them. Having taken countless rebirths, we have had all of these relationships, but we don't necessarily see that. And so in order to repay that kindness based upon seeing these other sentient beings, we give rise to this attitude of wanting to become a being who is able to work for the alleviation of the suffering of all sentient beings. And we think, I am going to become a fully enlightened Buddha, someone who has the capacity to really fully benefit others. And so with that kind of motivation, I'm going to strive to develop each good quality and get rid of each kind of fault that I have. And I will too become a fully enlightened Buddha. And for that purpose, I'm going to develop attitudes like love and compassion. And here, the kind of listening to the teachings of selflessness, develop an understanding, meditate on that in order to develop this direct realization.
토요 민지 마스 추베기오라 지시되네 다른 부당 미세와다 타이고 매네 미세와다 되게 다른 부르시네 통에나 일이야 아니 ቄ디 미추에 ቄ디 소바 티시도 토요라 메진베 추베기도 와서거라 지시 ቄ서 티시도 류니 기부터 나와서 지시 류니 기부터 나와서 그나 시간 소라 토요라 메 나와나시 내가 라조에 ቄ 저저 추베 ቄ 저저 봐도 류니 기부 나나시 지시 ቄ서 티시도 이게 통돼야 되시오라 기부 가사에 뭐다고 난게도 와서거라 토요 민나게도 와서거라 따든다 기부세 용도 깨바세 용도 따든다 미리 주고라 미리 나와 주고라 하시라 류니 기부터 나와서 이빼 자는 송거라 Geshe Chisi Laksola, Teyu Tisi Tuluna, Deshindo, Chisi do Luigi Yala, Angba Gola Sopa Tezo Sigurdo, Chisi Elia Temperatimbata, Yoba Tisi to Sigura, the Lu Koran Chajang Lu Telaya, Rangitani Tuba, Rawa to Tuba, now Nashi Tembayamba, or Tende now he would Sigura. You do say. Ishi Chisi Lakso Las Lugi Yala to Sulia, Noa, any Rangilis Cheche, Rilbu Chitu, Chashe Kaga Rede, Odorabchi, Rilbu Tato Zebasido, Ribu Tangidabichi Korama to Chensu, Yetevarach, some good rest. The one nation it to Chashe Chen in the Yamado Yomado. The other Marazu to Tomne, Richi, Louis Che, Miwa Nawa Chama Kanga, you get to Chia. Ngol nangi ora lute bar sembe tensi ti gore sumda oh yeah chishu
Câu kệ
So then having set our motivation for listening to these teachings on emptiness, here picking up in verse 84, and this is related to the verse that came above, when someone apprehends like a pillar or a pile of stones, a cairn, as being like a person due to certain conditions. So in 84, as long as there is the complex of conditions, so just how we might mistake that pile of stones for being a person when the conditions are right, like we're from a long ways away and the light is kind of dark and so forth, we're going to have that kind of mistaken perception. And so as long as there is the complex of conditions, the body appears as if it were a man, that kind of thing there appears as if it were a person, a being there. But so too, when it comes to our body, likewise, as long as the hands and so on are present, the body is seen there. So as long as we have this kind of collection, this assemblage of conditions, our hands and limbs, our head and limbs and so forth, there is this kind of grasping at true existence. It appears to us as though this thing, the body, existed somehow as like a whole, a solid whole, although it is something that is composed of various parts. It appears to us as though there were like something that were really existent in and of itself as a whole, a body. And so too, as long as the conditions are present, there will be that kind of appearance of the body as being truly existent, even though it isn't something more than what is merely designated upon that. It appears to be existent from its own side, somehow in and of itself.
yếu tố để tích hợp nên cái thân của con người nó còn tồn tại, thì lúc đó mình còn thấy cái thân này là tôi, là cái ngã.
oh yeah đó đi tiền ra sao lệ đó lệ gì chashe to rang shin ji meba tel pa ba su đó tanda ba do lệ tambani chashe so lệ rawa du to ba yo ma res lệ rang shin ji to ba lệ rebu ra to chi chang ga ju sam dang yo ra lệ rebu dang ni to rang shin ji to ba rawa du to ba chi yo ma res ti she so ki meba tel share ta tanda lệ chashe re ne nya goda kangba lakba sero tezu re ne rashi jituba yo ma re sikora yesu le tene ne lu se ya rashi jituba jimba yo gora so to su re rashi jituba yo ma re sti she to she de ne ma she o de ne de shin sorme so yin she re lakba ga shi yin bar je o de ne she lu ji ya la lakba da bula sikora ne lakba da bula so mo ta chi de zu kanga chokba le tene ne lakba se shagu yordo ishi sormo jugudo jusigora dezule tene ne lakba spa tag yora ishi sorme cho la takba imbe chirsigordo ene lakba kanshi imbar yos lakba se de ko sorme cho da chashe mambo chele tene tezu dakshi chene tele tene lakba se pa le pa tag yore sigora iso ja ko lakba se de rawa de chu de lakba de se chiklia ngunjin che chuktu ba do 딱 쇠버려 제 쇠버려 근데 요 말에 숨거라 이시 소미 초라 딱바 임비치나세 라바 강시 임버죠 라바 라문에 주바 라와도 주바 샤치 rilbundo chi su lakwa senge chi ngunzi chi tuwe chi yo ma re su go ra o tinga chu pa lo pa ta ma ta chi jini ka re o ti chi lam ne chi ka ni ti chi lam ne ta ma ya
Câu kệ
So
thứ
then we move to determining the lack of inherent existence of the various parts. So here we have been going through how the body as a whole is not somehow like autonomously or objectively existent. It's not inherently existent. But then moving to an analysis of each of the parts that compose such a body, like the body appears like it's something whole or solid. But yet, when we examine it, it's only made up of these various parts. And then, if one is to look at each of those parts in turn, and we can determine that those two are not inherently established. So, the first half then of 85 reads, likewise, what would a hand be other than an assemblage of fingers, or a finger other than its configuration of joints? Sorry. So just the first half of that. So here, when it comes to something like a hand, other than being designated on its various parts, like the fingers and the palm and the joints and so forth, there's nothing that we can identify as a hand. Although it seems as though there's something like there that's able to be pointed to, objectively existent, able to bear analysis or scrutiny, we can't actually identify something. So there's yeah.
oh ya oh lakwa de sormo sigla so ba te zol te ne ta ba re lakwa ra do tu ba chi ta su ba chi ngunzi che yo ma re che ra lakwa ka shi yin ba ju ra ngone tu ba ka shi yin ba ju de yo ma re che ra a te ya chi gi cho yin che se ro ya chi gi cho yin che sormo te ya so ra sigla so ba yo ra de lakwa de chi ku gu che ro do wa o te zol te ne ta gu ma to ya sormo se che loga kura rawa ngunzi che che yo ma ro Geshe mambu chashe mambu de kukuda mambu de wa tezul tene ne lakwa sta yo ra o asura lakwa kashi ba ju de so de ya chigi cho yin chi se chig de nga du chig yo trop trop se yong do chan da o chigi chokwal tene ta yo re se cho yin chi cho la ta ba yin be che na se de ya chigi cho yin chi re chi jang kashi 그냥 라고 대하라 시투바요 말을 치기 sol다고 그랬어. 치대야 고랑 차셔를 마부여라. 치래도 봐 치도 마부도와 그래서 차셔를 때는 딱 말해 마도 직생계제 라와 찍는 건지 제지요 말해서 거라. 치자랑이 차체에 차야 되듯이 치도 저봐 차체냐. 그 설무대 치를 때는 샤고요라. 치도 저야 랑 차셔를 제 마부여라. Titre mambo le tene ne pa son me six chat zu ta go ra. Ta da kandar babu kare na lu ji chok ba na ye be tu kan de chi na ko Quran cha sha chi le tene pa ta sha chi ba do rawa do su chi ngun ji chi yo ba chi yo ma re si go ra. Ya ti chi so na o de mer.
So here, continuing.
như chúng ta đi quan sát
So again, what would a hand be other than an assemblage of fingers, or a finger other than the assemblage of joints, or a joint other than its separate parts? So it seems like there should be something that we can identify as a hand. There appears this thing that's like autonomous, able to bear analysis or bear scrutiny, but we can't actually identify anything that exists as such. So then looking at the various components of the hand, like the fingers are likewise designated on their individual sort of parts, the configuration of our joints and so forth. You can't speak of a finger apart from that. Although it appears like there's something autonomous, really objectively existent as a finger, we can't, again, likewise, dividing that up into various parts, we see that it's something merely designated on a collection of parts, all the way down to the atoms. We can't find something that exists in that way when we analyze, as though it had this autonomous, independent existence in the way that it appears to us, other than being merely designated upon a collection of parts or conditions. There's no thing that exists in and of itself, although it would seem that there is. So too, with the first line of 86, those parts too exist only due to different atoms. And so going all the way down to the atomic level.
Yang ko pa chigene cha cho lo cho no cho che tudin condition ne shalu no chang ge cha she chi yo ro yesu le ten pa ta bo re ma do tudin chi rang wa chi chu ta su ba che su ba chi yo ma re so ra ko cha da bi shalu no chang ten wo la so ba in de le ten pa tudin cho shu ne te le ta ko yo ra tudin yang cho je ye wa ye se cha cho lo cho no cho ten wo si de pa che ne so ra 초야 차시에 당을 쳤어. 어디 초치네 고향 찔린 거지 제가 말은 샤초를 예배 뒤에서 찔리 차샤나야 대하고 고란 차시지요 그래. 들려. 라와도 두바치고 말해서라. 초야 차시에 당을 쳤어. 가신 때나 남과 나시레스 초스 동바리시레 마도 지트데 젠로나 라와도 두바치니요 말해서. 얘는 뒤에 매서 eso de tu de ako yu tashu de rawandu tubachi yo mares ora rawune tubachi yo mares ya tu chushu de rawune tubachi yo na ya zendo na shacho tu de rawune tuba yo de ya dele shacho lo chondo cho rawu tuba inde zendo na rawune tubachi yo ne tama chame chirago yo de jan ko shi ya mebe chi de ko ra yu chame se de 주도 아마 그래서 팀에 주도 뭐 다시 뒤참에 keling라 남벌에 keling게 와라 그래서 그 초초초한테 고시게 버르실래 저에 매버 고시게 매버 차잔이 시주 맹게지 랩고래서 그래 이 말에는 그 저에 매버제 유대 춘주질이야 고시까지 때문에 개비여나 리제부르럽지 뒤다 유대 춘주든지 뒤 장가냐 버려도 그래서 그래 버르질 고시게 매버지요 그래서 그래 Uma bada semjamba tudo como tu tulia chachi que mengeji yo mares agora chachi que mengeji yo na ani zambulin chambu tudo mares tu te chilia ni tu sum tu ni cheru zambulin chaura o ti de ko tu te chame na tu te ki de tu te chi yo ba che intela cho shi te wo ni ne tu te tu so na o cha tu yo go res agora de cho shi ne je chen te wo che cha tu yo 그래. 참에 얘네 차 두대 봐 찍바 차로 봐 두대 배찍 차로 거라. 채로 줘야 매바 차로라. 채로 줘야 얘네 찍질 돈두스 대오라 라과 투네 도시네 고 채로도 가가 되도. 채로 줘야 매네 데 템로나네 채로 줘야 매바 차라. 어떤데 껴요 레스 시도. 야, 이치선 한데.
So continuing with the rest of verse 86, it then says, and even the atoms exist only due to the divisions of their directional facets. Since those directional facets have no intrinsic parts, they are like space. Thus, the atom does not intrinsically exist. So here, like dividing all the way down to individual atoms, one can't posit something that's like an autonomous sort of single thing that's able to bear analysis or bear scrutiny, that is autonomous and exists in and of its own right as for example, an atom, a truly existent and autonomously existent atom, other than something that is designated upon, again, something having parts. So here, those atoms exist only due to the divisions of their directional facets. If it doesn't have various directional facets like above and below and northeast, southwest, it would become again something that there are certain Buddhist schools that accept that there are partless particles that are sort of the building blocks for everything in the external world. They say that if you don't have those kinds of fundamental building blocks, then how can you have this sort of build up of a larger external form? So they would assert that there's this autonomously truly existent atom. But the response to that by those that don't assert it is that an atom itself, there really can't be a truly partless particle. There's not something we can assert that can no longer be divided, because if you would get to a point, when it's no longer divisible, it's the smallest possible atom and has no directional parts, then how would those atoms conglomerate, come together in order to build larger forms? So thereby, the smallest particle and Mount Meru would have to be the same size. If there's no way to have like the eastern part of an atom touch the western part of a different atom, they can't come together. If they're partless, they just sort of basically collapse into one. There's no parts to be able to conjoin together into larger particles. And so here, it would not be suitable to have any sort of larger gross forms if you were to assert partless particles. This is the kind of response to that. So really, when we begin to analyze all the way down to the very atoms that make things up, we can't find an inherently existent atom, a truly existent atom. Although things appear to us to exist in that way, they're merely designated on the basis of designation. In the case of an atom, it has to be designated upon that which has various parts in order for that to be something which can connect with other atoms and build larger forms, for example. So here, the conclusion to this analysis is that since those facets have no intrinsic parts, they are like space. There's no inherently existent or intrinsically existent atom.
Vì tế đó nó có nhỏ tới đâu cũng vẫn phân chia được, không thể phân chia nữa, cái hạt đó không tồn tại. Về nó cũng có những cái phương hướng của nó ở đông tây nam bắc trên dưới, nên từ dù nó nhỏ đến thế nào nó cũng phải có, nó có thì nó mới dính như hạt khác rồi nó mới trở thành lớn lên.
Một số đấy, ở toàn địa đang ăn cho con sao? Ở trên nó, lưỡi răng xin mẹ bà sống rồi đó, lưỡi răng xin mẹ bà, mình làm đáp bù lại chắc bằng lưỡi resti xe đó, lưỡi đi, mà ra đến nằm dưới sân bên này xe, răng hoa đồ trâu bà, răng hoa nhẹ trâu bà, đó, ở trên đây chỉ rìu bút chích, mấy cái nào chỉ lưỡi là sao bà càng cái số trái trâu rồi sẽ càng cái thông cái trái thông cái chỉ, ở đó rồi chích nguyên gì chỉ chúc thua rồi chỉ. Kawai diyin sero chi ngunji chi ewe soris nagi ora. O tende de yo ma rese. Milam tabu rese. Milam tandu chi na de yo arte. One nawa na shin tata demba yo marwa. Nga ranzo liu sudu sosu liu sudu. Ito wa da chi kar so rawa do chi tong. Tele tene liu le shenja ki. Chi yo tong rangi liu da shenji liu le swakari na yo. O ti sonda tele shenji chabu re ma re songara. Milam na shi temba mare ngara zu nawa na shi da samba na shi temba yo mare lu ne chu tinde chi yo mare se atal ma bu tu saro lu cha chen lu rangu ne yo mare cha she yala re rangu ne yo mare ti tu re ne rangu ne yo mare se pa mada ma je be se chi to ro chi ye be so re chi duwa one ta shi che ga do ne ko ra ye yo marwa ta se ba ta che se ba yo mare so so nawa le tinde chi 통만면에 ቋ배와게 도도로 질화 삼개월마다 된다시오 말했어. 디시도 저는 류디 밀람다고 나와다도 땜바 매봐. 문제지에 매봐 진짜 소다. 열레 착바르게 말했어. 현지 착바시라. 가간 로야메리 슈굴이야 눔테브나 시리제 가간 로야메리 가두이네 소송에 나이셔데 가두이네 바제 가가시에 카보여버리스도가 어딜에 신자스기거라 이게 르레스 티치지레스와 짬된 신자스기가 말해 이때 다좀 버sol래 용구라 티케라 르르레스 산제게 티치고도 디케라 녀드레스 레베스도 직대나 드다 traso스 Kerang chiri ma re sonda ko sandam chi shaura di kerang kang barwa so o re se ora ma to shira yin je ken me do ma re kyab de ma zu phne pe yo de ha ko do ve ne chu ma kyab de thom ya ko ja sha ne pe yo ra me che kyab de ke rang yin ke be do kang ga le sa ra su long ba da na de kang ga te le sa ra da nga da nge su u zu ra ja ga cha wa ma to chi shen ja ro che ma to o ti sonda kar su ra 안디르 셴모치 다 차고 메르세티라 테터 밀람 타부이 소글라 쫀덴 수시 차스 마라주 류데야 밀람 타부 나와나 시템바 메바치레 테테만보 제 사샹게 라 롱다치 테테담바다 사다 추담베 타부도 줄라 사시그라 추스도 타다 도줄 시그담바다 사토도 사시가 말에 이부사미 추마이 미밀루메 남가메시도 테테만보 제 소된게 저라 네 코란즈 손이 레가르 제제 판두 순두 제다 지미 토야다 암저 거야다 지 차대와라 에테 멜랑고 소라치레 튜베 소라치라 주마다 보세 가그레스니 찌르는 건지 제가 돈을 라야게요 말아 코라 레가 제대거라 제대거라 땡제 대판을 좀 아시더라 나뭐 근데 손에 찌르도 레가 지거라 징게디 가레스는 랑원에 들어가서 삼반에 시와 말아 자예나 오포 자야고 매섬도 소소르파 따위어라 그 제단지만 르파 따샤라 뜻다래서 야구 쇼지도 하시도 뜻파 따위어라 이마도 그 랑원의 야보다 다이메네 그도이나 그 따차고라 대우를 대우 말아 이마지 드송도 담메도라 이 동화를 지나 이마지 만드는 이도 명하셔서 르 따다치다 피게 소다치다 소소 삼로파 따다치래 샤고를 마도 이거라 랑원의 지위네 그도이나 다가 대우라 랑신기 좀나 랑원의 좀네 제가 막 나라 좀 메디지 소시나 나랑 그 요래 삼고도 소보다 셈다 초와다 망보질 때네 레가르 제제 선체 두여마도 나랑 라와진 수체가 요 말아 이 경고 제대 또서 하고도 당부도 진두디 잔담 유네시베 샴베르 레제 바스르 제대 첩민 도셔요라 이제 드로지도 아니 드로지도 다등에만 내시데메도 삼 신내지 소르도 라와체네케 드레데요 말아 당부 삼을는 뜻이거든 어디 이제 다른 디스 아마다 대단 멜람다부에 솔라 쩐데 수시 차세 현재 차바 하장 차바 이렇게 말했습니다. 야, 되지라.
So here, then in the next verse, it turns to the topic of how it's not logical to be really attached to our body because our body is sort of like a dream. It's something that lacks inherent existence. So it says here in the first half of 87, what discerning person would be attached to form, which is thus like a dream? And so here, when it seems when it appears to us as if though there is this really like solid thing there, this objectively existent, something that could bear scrutiny or analysis, that we could somehow point to it. But when we do this kind of analysis, there actually isn't something there. Now, we normally see our body with a kind of attachment or desire for it. It's something that we see as being attractive or something that's desirable for us. And it doesn't really exist in that way. We've analyzed up until now, going through these various parts, the body as a whole. It seems like it exists like that, but when we analyze, it's not really existent among any of its parts. And we go through all of those parts all the way down to the atoms, and we are able to see that it actually doesn't really exist in the way that it seems. And so here, when it comes to this kind of body that we have taken, when we don't investigate and analyze, we can talk about like, oh, I'm doing this or I'm doing that. We can sort of identify, but it's really the kind of appearance of the body as being solid, objectively existent, something that's like able to bear analysis. And based upon that, we give rise to a kind of clinging attachment for this body. Just sort of like when you put oil on paper or oil on cloth, and it's really like difficult to separate from. You can't get those sort of things out. That's the kind of sense that we have toward our body and our sense of this I. And now this is something that like arhats or those who have progressed further, they don't necessarily, it's not as though they can't use the word I, like, oh, this is my body, or I am an arhat, this is my house, and so forth. But rather than take the sort of basis and cling to it in the way that we do based upon grasping at it as being inherently or truly existent, they're able to see it as being sort of like dream-like. If we have this kind of uh, basis and cling to it as existing in the way that it appears, we give rise to that kind of strong clinging for it. Whereas we can see that when we examine, like the verse by Nagarjuna, the person is not earth, not water, not fire, not wind, not consciousness, not space, nor are they the composite, the collection of all of those. So what then is the person? So it is like the hard parts of our body, the sort of solidity and then the fluidity, the heat and so forth. When we look through all of those elements, there's nothing that we can point to that really is the person. When we look, we can't find it, but yet we can talk about agents doing actions and the person existing and living and so forth, but it doesn't exist in the way that it normally appears to us. So we have this kind of like thought, when we think like, oh, that's my enemy, it seems like that person from over there is really truly existent as one's enemy. But we know that's not true. The kind of way that we feel toward them can change. It's not the case that they depend, that they are in all situations, in all conditions, our enemy, or appear to all people as being our enemy. But rather it's dependent upon our mental imputation, the way that we designate how it is. And so if it existed, again, this basis for clinging, when we hold to our body, for example, as being really truly existent, that's what gives rise to our attachment. Like, for example, but if you take away that sort of basis, you no longer have that kind of clinging for it. Like the way that we experienced as Tibetans, just sort of having our country and taken away from us. There's no longer that same sort of basis for clinging, although we can pick up to clinging to being Indian and so forth. But here, as it says in this first half of the verse, what discerning person would be attached to form, which is thus like a dream? So recognizing that our form, for example, doesn't exist in the way that it appears to us, we should give up that kind of attachment, but it's quite difficult to part from.
남주단 덴바 삼을단 신게치네 르르시다 셴지 차고 자르기 말에세 가레세나 공가라주 남주 삼바나시 텐징기 삼바나시 나다 데요 말에서 거라 텐징기 삼바나시 담바 투바 라와도 투바 바 mik바테 mik테스라 mik바테스 삼바나시 페로 이셔 mik바테바나시 나다 데요 말에서 거라 예선자 코시라 현지 차고를 말해서 거라. 아이네 양디 네 냠도 하고로 아주 류셰도 류레까지 미사회 거로 마부셰그라 에라고 류교 마부셰그라 가슬라임바 Rabdu Chong and China Koya, Emeta Kebata Tindre, Lula Chashi, and Chashin Doechido, Negabiatico, Luli Chavora, in the Kermabusam Koyora. Ichidan con Yamundo Etondalia, so in a Keva Mavayan Sam Koyora. Oti the Kuliti, Ganga Yosa Shiriji Lure Dora. Such a new lady Pumbuchu Chese. Dunga did Tata Nive Sochi Tensi Vichisuda. And the Kanga Lul than Yogara. When you learn you just let a number bonge, so which could say telepa what you do in Manya Ranya Resara. When the Karinyagun Naya or Saya or the Shea or the Kaganda Kanga Yora, Saya Kugi Toya Kugudo, Koya Kugudo, Mira, and it Gokutsama Lu del Koya Mamuchi Yora Tezo Kanga Kaya Chedo Mezikaguda. I call Lu the Chichi to Trana Shire Soda. Trana should never can get on the Trasagora. In a day and Lu Tabuma Sungju Chamber got in the Maris. Lu ne Tradar Tomate, Lu de Trana Shire Stendo Samutana. Tunge Kanga Yang Chugati, Lu de Yuguda, Koko Kanga to Lu del Telekoguda. In the Samutana never can get the Trara Sigora Namja. And never can get on the Samutana Trana Shire. Yadana at the Suncha, Ina at the Luya was Sungju Chavores. Messitisura. Kimda Deba Sawapa. Hemba troops and get message gave you na. Lu Tillet and the pet and Dutch and we are to you a reservoir. Chimde Irin saw on it. Sawapa, she shall pember to church that to be some tangachina. Lu the pets are Chimbodes or Chimde Irin on it. Telesonum Chimbuches. Rajibu saw a care my by Shandang some Jawa love Chimbutu. So Tit and Lu. Sojo Chevore, Chotin Chevore, Tato Chevores, Siludi Yavune, Tapsi Chevores of your Matayan, Louis Gertin or another Kangalune Yogure, Ayuk shows Karchenes, this is your Marta, or teaches him here.
Nên cái nhìn thấy
So,
thì thấy cái
here again, this kind of the way that our body appears to us, it appears as though it's like solid, objectively existent from its own side, somehow like autonomously existent. But if you know how to think about this, then you can get rid of the kind of way of grasping at this. It doesn't exist in the way that it appears to us, and thereby it doesn't exist in the way that it appears to our true grasping or the way that true grasping holds it, as it is like the referent or the mental aim that we have. And so we need to understand this in order to reduce and get rid of that kind of attachment to our own body or the bodies of others by seeing the defects of this. So here we also need to understand this, though, in conjunction with the fact that so here we often see their descriptions of the defects of the body. Often this is in the context of speaking to monks or those who have taken ordination in order to get rid of their attachment for the other sex, but also for our own thinking about the fact that these, I mean, we identify so strongly with our body, with our aggregates, but really these appropriated aggregates are suffering. They're identified as the truth of suffering because it's on this basis that we experience the sufferings of birth and aging and sickness, death. All of the difficulties in terms of like needing things is due to our body. So really, in some ways, our body is kind of like an enemy. We have to do all of these things, all of this work just to sustain our body. But this is not saying that we should just then neglect or sort of give up caring for this body. But we should recognize that if we use this in accordance with the Dharma, it's something that can create a great deal of merit. So if we act according to the Dharma in a way where we don't harm others, where we are trying to be as beneficial to them as possible, this is something that is incredibly precious. So rather than being somehow an instruction that we don't need to take care of our body or think about our health because look at it, it's just unclean and the source of our suffering, rather we should understand that we should use this body for a purpose. So as Shantideva says, although we can kind of see it as our enemy, we should still take care of this body because it is with this body, with this set of aggregates, that we are able to achieve a really vast benefit. So we shouldn't neglect our aggregates and just give up taking care of them, but rather should do so with the right kind of intention and purpose.
Nên tìm mọi cách để bảo vệ thân này, để làm những cái việc phước thiện để giải thoát khổ đau.
chụp kia ra ta lư rang sinh chi mẹ thế nên lư thì là tên này tác về khán giả thì rang sinh chi chụp chi cũng mà đấy sẽ rang vào chỉ rồi cô ra chỉ rồi chỉ cô ra người này chú lư sẽ được lẽ cái chuyện rồi bù được chỉ cái chỉ ra rang sinh chi chụp rang người này chụp chụp được chụp thì chụp rồi tạo sự được chụp chế sự được chụp sẽ rồi chỉ chú nó chú sẽ được chỉ tu sắm sẽ được chỉ là chú sẽ ở mà ra mà bố chỉ sau vào là tên phá lừa ta thì lẽ cái chỉ được tự lẽ cái chỉ mà sao cái chỉ ra nó lẽ cái chuyện cái hiện tại tôi rồi ya lừa rồi cha sinh lừa cái làm go càng bớt rồi ya chỉ bớt rồi đó nó làm bớt sinh sinh chỉ bớt rồi đó ya tự nhiên rồi sinh chỉ bớt rồi đó lừa đi rồi tôi chụp mẹ chỉ hiện tại yêu bây giờ thì để mà rồi càng sao rồi tôi chụp mẹ lừa rồi tôi chụp yêu để mà càng cái chỉ bớt rồi người này luôn ya càng cái chỉ bớt rồi đó 산제의 심장이나라 가리네 치버리 되어라 어때 손자다 류랑시메나 류텔라테네 딱비 끼부 민데시네 미 류레테네 딱여라 미리스라 연루에네 텐루 류레테네 디탄루리 키레 따르 발라르스 파타여라 예데코 류코라 라와도 투바 딱스바 주주세 찍메나 란디리스 라운네 주주세메나 아니 Jadi tak berkasa orang ini cuba yang kemarin, rawan tu cuba yang kemarin seorang, rawan tu cuba senai, rawan tu cuba. Pungbu korang main ke taksi seorang, taksi am casa je, mampu kasih so antel balu bah, lagi orang di cici dah se tak serah, lepas tak berapa, lepas orang ke pasar ke orang mana korang rawan tu cene, ngadi yang sesuatu rawan cene cuba ke orang mana. Cik tu ye siwa mare, lega cengke kasih silian pa mingji tak segera. Tokbe wang ki pa sha, cutam je tokbe tak sem, lo wang ki sha bares, lo lempa rai mambu legi doa. Oh ti segera, oh tena kasram. Kanji teda lu meba, jese ke kan peme kas, lu rawa du tubachi mena, ane lu le tene tak be kansa rawa du tubachi. Kalau yang tu yang mana segera, boleh dia rasa cuba mana, kalau tak begini kasa rasa cuba yang mana sih, boleh kita sana.
So then, continuing into the second half of verse 87, it says, here, if there is, again, our body is not something that exists as like an autonomous sort of solid concrete thing, like something that you can point to when you analyze, it could bear analysis or bear scrutiny, then so too the various components of the body, the head and the hands and so forth, are likewise not able to bear analysis. They appear to have this kind of autonomous existence, but they also don't actually have that sort of existence. And so the very bodies, all the way down to the parts of those bodies, all the way down to atoms, are not things that we can point to and say they have this kind of existence, or they have this sort of objective existence in this way. And so here, the bodies that comprise sentient beings, then the sentient being, the person that is designated on that body, is also not autonomously existent in that way. So here, whether it's like a Buddha or a sentient being, they are equally not truly existent, not autonomously existent, but rather merely designated by thought, posited by a name and thought on the basis of designation. So therefore, if the body does not truly exist, who is a real man and who is a real woman? There's no sort of real, in the sense of being autonomous and objectively existent person that can be found on the basis of these aggregates, in the same way that we couldn't find a body within the various components or parts of that body. Within the basis of designation of the person, there's nothing that is autonomously or objectively existent, concrete or solid, that we can point to, other than the person being designated, posited by a thought.
Cái nơi cơ sở để dán đặt cái tôi đó nó không có tồn tại rồi thì làm gì có cái tôi, có một cái hữu tình, có một cái cá thể nào để tồn tại. Nếu nó có thì nó có trên cái nền tảng để hình thành nên nó, nhưng mà cái nền tảng đó không tồn tại rồi thì làm gì nó tồn tại. Nên nó chỉ phụ thuộc vào những cái chức năng hoạt động mà chúng ta gán cho nó như thế này như thế kia, nó làm việc này làm việc kia. Nên nói tóm lại, tất cả các pháp chỉ là do cái tư duy chúng ta gán đặt thôi. Nó hoàn toàn không có một thực thể, không tồn tại độc lập và không tồn tại một cách kiên cố.
Đúng rồi. Ta đang đồng ý để mà thành tựu sẽ được lưu vào trong đó chuyên chú cho chúng ta mà sĩ ở đó, cho nên là nằm bờ là chúng ta mà sĩ ở đó, cho nên là mà thành tựu sẽ chúng ta cái sự sẽ thấu suốt được cái ở đó. Thì lưu trên nó càng sao ta mới sẽ sao sao ta đó, càng sao ràng được chú mẹ bà, càng sao ràng này mẹ bà đó, càng sao ta mới sẽ đó. Chơi ràng này mẹ bà đó chơi gì ta mới, càng sao là xem về số tra trị rồi để cho nó số mà, thế rồi ràng được mẹ bà đó chơi gì ta mới sẽ đó. Càng sao ta mới sẽ ta đã càng sao kêu sẽ thế rồi, càng sao những cái xem trên những cái gì đó, thế rồi ràng về càng sao mẹ bà đó, càng sao ta mới sẽ đó. Su rāngā tu mē bā, chā rāngā tu mē bā, chī rāngā tu mē bā sā nē chē jī tā mē sī yuwa rē. Mā tēn yu lū lā kāngsā tā mē tā chē jī tā mē lē, kē shī tī lē, kē shī tī jī kāngsā yī bā tā, chī tī kāngsā mā yī bē, sū chā chī rā chā lā sū bā yī bē, kē bā rī yuwa rā mā tā, kāp chā tī chī bā rī, rāngā tu chū bā mē bā tā lā, rāngā nē chū bā mē bā, sū tu tu chū bā mē bā, o tī chī bā rā. Chū tā mā shān tā chā nē yā, Semta bada dote bada sera tuda mo shanda nambe tuda mo shanda ya chene kansa tambe sede rangune me bada dan de tele shag maro ya kansa tambe sede thara ra mabu che do nangbo ya kansa de soso de takba me ba chikbu chame me ba takji rawa chen ta se chiriba to ne takba chikbu rawa chen ta yo se ra takba nyuro menge jibu chame, ganzu chamambu che, dakshi se te likaze o kona jibu, te togu roba kwa mare, shenla tenjen rel go mare, takwa jibu se, chachi ki mewa. O tende, dakshi rawa chenji ta mewa se, chida nangba chama ka dakshi rawa chenji ta me se gore, chiriba tsugu dakshi rawa chenji ta yo se gora, zo ta liya mambu dosa, la digre, ote, dakshi rawa chenji ta mewa talya, chirubagi tayo se nangba mes, nangba da chiba tsoya de tere, dakshi rawa chenji tayo mele chigara. Sanje chumden teke dakshi rawa chenji ta mes ora. Isu dani, shenda kyaga, rupta shenda nangba, ta meba mawa re se re, Thabkhe lembu se re, Thabkhe melemba ma re. Tenchin trebar chunga Thabkhe lengi ora, ta mena ni ka, Khoa da, Tunghe da, Tharba da, Thamji kemba sheyo mara. Ayo are, ta me se de dakshi rawa chenji ta me se, wa. Ina she ne, ili chik se chi tuwa. Ina she kansa rangye tuwe che ki ta me se re, shenda nangye tuta ma mabu chik tili to se chaga che. Rangye tuwe che ta se, ta nguyen zimba la pungbu dabu chi nguyen se ne, chi sin ma do koran jang jang kadu nguyen si che yo marwa. Yana sobu dabu chi, yana sem daji sosu sosu ne, sem daji, yana kondu dabu chi, dashi anga kondu simba kibu me se re. Inde shene taa zing nguyen zing gura ma do, chilo na paa tene maa cha sobu songa la tene taa songu taa ma do, sobu paa sha taa dire si kadu li, Người sống chỉ có mà rồi xem là chả đem mình đâu. Thế sau đó đi là rangya tu về chạy cái ta me ba sửa thì ra qua được chỉ rồi tanda ta me se rawa ta me se đi là ra qua đấy rangya tu về chạy cái ta me se kansa ta me sha che cái ta me se ya shanda xem ra bài này Quran chỉ sai rồi umar anh tu ya loga sai rồi tanda đi là cari sai rồi thế này kansa ta me da che cái ta me gì thara cái yo mà chỉ bớt đấy sẽ rồi oh ya thế này Today Shandai Kansa Tamis to Ranket to be say Tame Vasha. Shake Tamis Nea, then Tampa Truba Sharbu to the Sagra, in the Chabayo Marichara. Oh, T. Dunicasa. Today Shandai Nea, Yanduta Ranget to Suge. Ame Tomba Tog Mari, Shake Tame Togre Marisha. Did to the Tenjo Lucene, Yanduta Ranget, Trashum Bedebuya Togalaya. Kansa tame togre, chigi tame togre. Kasha yang kodu kansa tame togre, chigi tame togre na magusa tinde. Tenyu lula lawe yomar samlu yomar. Chibare. Yandu ranje tarwa togu na chigi tame togre, kansa tame togre. O tichi lamne ati shungde chode Quran duwat. Ya.
So here in this guide to the Bodhisattva's way of life, this is being taught from what is considered to be the sort of highest of the various four philosophical schools. So here I'll try to use one term consistently, but this is the Prasangika school, or sometimes in English we call it the consequentialist school. And so here we've already explained the kind of selflessness of the person, and then there is the selflessness of phenomena. So the selflessness of phenomena includes things like forms and sounds and smells, those kinds of external objects, things besides the person. And so the selflessness of the person and the selflessness of phenomena are, for the Prasangikas, a matter of distinguishing between what is the basis of designation. So the lack of autonomous existence on the basis of a person is the selflessness of the person, whereas that kind of lack of an autonomous, objectively existent self on the basis of other phenomena is then the selflessness of phenomena. So that it's the same thing that is refuted, but rather it is based upon the basis of designation upon which that is being refuted, that we make that distinction. And so for the rest of these tenant schools, the autonomists, the Svatantrika or autonomists and below, they would assert that the selflessness of the person is different from the selflessness of phenomena. It's not actually just a matter of the basis of designation we're talking about, but a difference in terms of the subtlety of the thing refuted. So there is a kind of refutation. All Buddhist schools reject the idea of a permanent, partless, autonomous kind of a self. So permanent in the sense of being like unchanging and solitary or partless, in that it doesn't have parts or depend upon anything else. This kind of self is something that is asserted by non-Buddhists. And so Buddhists within India became known as proponents of no self because they asserted that there was no such permanent, unitary, autonomous self. And so for those non-Buddhists, they say, well, you can't have karma or liberation without such a self. And so that's why they assert that. But here, Buddhists are able to, even in the absence of such a self, assert the existence of karma, cause and effect, as well as their the possibility of liberation. And so here, the other tenant schools, again, below the Prasangikas, assert that that first level of the selflessness of the person is slightly more coarse than the more subtle sort of understanding, which would be in observing our aggregates. And now usually when we think I in terms of the person, it's on the basis of a physical form. Sometimes we designate on the basis of a mind, like when someone is angry or the various kinds of thoughts or feelings that they have. But most often it's on the basis of the physical aggregates. And we have this sense of an I that is self-sufficient and substantially existent. For them, the lack of such a self-sufficient, substantially existent person, self of the person, is the selflessness of the person. That's the most subtle kind of understanding of the selflessness of the person. And for the mind-only school and the Svatantrikas, they assert different understandings, more subtle or different sort of distinctions for the selflessness of phenomena. And they also would assert that others of the lower vehicle or the Pali tradition don't actually realize the selflessness of phenomena or emptiness. They assert that by realizing the selflessness of the person, one can attain the liberation of an arhat. But for the prasangikas, this is not the case. Everyone, whether a hearer, solitary realizer, or a bodhisattva, has to realize this level of emptiness that is the selflessness of persons and phenomena. They're lacking that kind of autonomous, independent existence. So again, this is being taught from the perspective of the prasangikas, but we should be aware of the different kinds of assertions of these different tenant schools.
And the name of the Shigata, Toa Trambani Shasset, Lut Tor Semchu Shisset, Toa Trambani Shashegua, Toa Lia, Toa Tombani Shegora, Toa Latini Shenjakanga Kayogordo, or Tidia, Toa Tombani Shegua. You should do the transit of Kashin Shegua, Toa Dea, Dunges Toyongo, Rawa to Tuyo Mares, it's so a Jew. Rawa to your marriage. So you round to your marriage. So a young gang sheba round to your marriage. Panja Masha, the Taco Richard Bachi Ungra. Oh, Tina Natatambo. So a Tungera Shigi, Matubati Shedua. Or did you love Shangal?
So that then finishes the close placement of mindfulness of the body, examining how the body doesn't actually exist in the way that it normally appears to us. And now we turn to the refutation or the close placement of mindfulness on feelings. And first, kind of looking at the fact that our feelings, likewise, that we normally sort of think are autonomously or independently existent, they don't actually exist in that way. So this is getting at the emptiness of feelings. Our feelings lead us to the kind of clinging that we normally have. And so here it will go through various kinds of ways of examining the emptiness of feelings in terms of looking at the feelings themselves, the sort of causes of those feelings not being independently or autonomously existent, the objects of our feelings not having that kind of independent existence, the one that's experiencing the feelings and so forth. It will go through various levels of analysis or objects of analysis here. And this begins then with establishing that the feeling of suffering is not inherently established.
Oh, yeah, this has, yeah. I think only so. Oh, the theater. That's what Tungerang should do your Marti Shagaba. Oh, Sorang Shimbache. Tunge Tini to you na. Chidi Rabka. la menese dera 동해 대 초와 동해 대 시고라 용자게 초와 동해 대 시고라 용자 동해다 용지 초와 베코나니도 베코나니도 세타 다다밤 라와도 투바 다다바 투바 요 마레 시고라 오 되네 동해 베코나니도 요나 세타 다바 투바 라와도 투바 치 요나 시고라 지데 랍가 라 메네세 이네코 이 시베 이 시바님도 깨고요라 가시바 남신님도 깨고라 소아 동해지 이 시바를 깨고요나 아니 소아 동해디 동해 깨고요나 데 대화데 깨고 말해서 거라 동해디니 또요나서 소아 동해디 라와도 주바 라군에 주바 치요 나서 거라 아치데 랍가라네 줘서 랍가데 이지 야와들야 메뉴도 내고 그래서 어떻게 와래 내 그래서 와라 와 영장기 때문에 이 가르선테 엄마 태교하잖아 라신기 트롭소나 그 지금 맹게 딱 버려서 그거 열었다 나가랑 대고지 그 라신기 트롭스 코나 라신 수트나 그다 괜찮을 뜻이 들면 그거를 차거라 동해대 라와도 트롭시 여봐야다 라신기 쫓게고 있나 네 얘기 쉐발에 동해 라신기 쫓게고 있나 그 지금 말에 교단 깨를 떠봐 매봐 그거라 와티나다 소 대화데 깨도 말해서 거라 이까지 이기 일이야 소 대화데 깨도 말 가르스네 동해 고 깨지 받아야 그래 잘해 동해대 뭐 되게도 동해 등이 또 여나 시대 랍가라 메네세 동해대 등담바 투바 여나 얘네 대 가르소래 등담바 투바 이나고 랑신기 투고 랑신기 투면고 샹라 때면고는 코나께 온 게지 그거래 걔나니 뜻다도 내기래 네 대화계로 지금 말해서 거라 대화는 대화계 두고 말해서 거래 와 동해 랑신기 투바이나 그 샹도 주라요 말해 따도 따갈 때 그래 얘네 랍가스도다 셰바리 이기 셰바리 아테네 대화대 너네 뜻게 두고 말해서 거라 대화계 왜 그거 매번 줄 그래서 뭐 대선자고 대화계도 삼살 대화계 삼살 동해계로 삼살 세바기부시 삼살 세바메기부시 감회가 마부양아요라 대선자고 동해이나 대화이나 가려이나 랑신기 투바 랑원에 수투바되고 말했어 땡진 레버리조에 깨와요라 마부질레 땡진 레네니 그브리 동해계고 그브리 대화계 온 거라 랑신기 투바이나 그 랑신 단에 주메다 샬라 떠바 매바 다 측절라고 말해. 랑신기 투바에는 공부로도네 쥐고 말해. 코란 랑신기 투바라. 그다 깽기 쥐고 말해. 뢰파다고 말해. 와. 그 시한데 쥐면 그것이 고대가 됐습니다. 이 따도 땡게리 싶고요라. 됐습니다. 야, 되질라나.
So, here, then, beginning in the first half of 88, it says then, if suffering exists in reality, why does it not prevent joyful experiences? So, here, the experience of a feeling is not ultimately established. If it were the case that something like, for example, our suffering were inherently or ultimately established, then it would have to be really existent like that. So, for example, when we have suffering in our mental consciousness, I mean, that suffering feeling is not our mental consciousness, so there's a level of dependence there. But when we have that kind of suffering feeling, if it were the case that it were really, truly existent, inherently existent in the sense of not depending upon other causes or conditions, then it would have to be just like that. Like it would have to be something that is unchanging. So we could not possibly sort of feel happiness, for example, because no causes or conditions could change that kind of suffering that is inherently existent. If it were the case that this suffering were ultimately existent or had that sort of level of inherent existence, then it would not always be there. It wouldn't depend upon certain sort of causes or conditions, meeting with a certain object or anything like that, but rather it would always have to exist and be there. And there would be no way to generate mental happiness. There would be no cause that one could meet that could somehow alter that sort of suffering. And so we see, though, that this is not the case. Sometimes we experience suffering, sometimes we experience happiness. There are different kinds of suffering and happiness that we experience dependent upon meeting with certain conditions, various causes. So it is because, again, they're not inherently existent, that they are dependent upon all of these causes and conditions for their coming about. So here, as the Venerable Nagarjuna has explained, if something has that kind of inherent existence, it means that it doesn't need to be altered or sort of fixed, rely upon any other causes and conditions for it coming about. And so too, that means it's inalterable, it's unalterable. If we have inherently existent suffering, there's no sort of cause that could create any kind of change in that. But we see that this is not the case, because we can see that these are occasional. We have times where we're happy and times where we're sad. Therefore, these are dependent upon causes and conditions, undermining their having some kind of inherent existence.
Các cái duyên mà nó sinh khởi, cho nên đôi khi có vui, đôi khi có buồn, cho nên nó có sinh và có diệt. Bản chất chứng tỏ rằng nó không có tự có, nó không có tồn tại cách độc lập. Nếu mà nó có tự có tồn tại cách độc lập thì chúng ta không thể nào cải biến, không thể nào thay đổi được. Nên tỷ tà là không cần phải cái tâm thức chúng ta dán đặt cho. Lúc nào nó cũng bản chất của nó là vậy rồi, nó không mãi mãi buồn hoặc mãi mãi vui. Tại vì nó đã tồn tại có tự tính riêng, độc lập, không phụ thuộc cái khác, thì nó không có sinh ra, không có diệt đi, thì sẽ không có tồn tại. khi mà nó không có thể nào mà mãi mãi vui, không thể nào mãi mãi buồn, bởi vì chúng ta thấy cái sự sinh diệt thì nó đã phụ thuộc vào điều kiện và duyên khởi.
Ôi da, anh đi rồi ta, 이거 소화 대화랑 신기 맞춰봤어도 소화 대화대랑 신기 조금 말했어. 이제 대화를 중에 겨울에마도 랑신기 조금 말, 랑원에 조금 말, 랑경을 조금 말해. 현달라 뜻인 전에 늘려 다니 봐 조금 샤고를 마도시어라. 어디 얘는 양의 동서라서 양에게 가실로 소소 부시월라 속바다 근데 동해만 부양하여라. 아마도 집에 부 자주 무시우시한테 정보를 좀 동해서 용구라. 얘는 양의 동서라서 양의 동에 네 미터슬라스고라 우다 아마도 바바카리인데 다 강에 있는 용주어라. 어떻게니 양의 제지 되어라고 동서라. 그러니까 심소 지대 감에지 심부스 칼라 심부테 아니 고도로도 야부테 제 가부 요한 탭시 지나고 가부 요한 도에 가부지라 남주 칼라 심부스 아니 지 자제부체 도로도 야부테 지나 가부 요구라 어떻게 고된 날씨 가부 용구 말아 그래서 심소 지대 감에지 세래 어떻게 요라 라운에 주바이나 양에게 동서나 그냥 양의 동서라 심소 지대 감에지 칼라 심볼라 소바 대외 차진 도속에 랑신디 주베 랑은에 대화 지키기 연하시고라 랑은에 대화 지키기 연하 뒤도상 칼라 심부세 남주대 치버로 그 남주 대화 지키거라 칼라야보다 더 주탄신에 꼭 가보용그라 뒤도 꼭 가보용 말와 지금 가르쳐내 용도 말했으나 대화 랑신디 주베이나 대화 계시 칼라 심부되게 대화 랑신디 주바지 아끼기 연하 또 남주내시 대고로 끼고로 끼기요 말아 몇개 가르쳐놓고 삼로 단다가 누구여라 칼라 대치버는 남주 대화기에 들어와 가보용에 들어 mi kabura chine namji thoya mi ti kabutong gora. Meto dumre reji chin kebura chine kobe namji meto dumre na chi pa chi temute kabuyo gora. Tako drama dre chi chi chonsona. Roa kora ke nyete lab chi shiwa nabti de chonsona. Ite tagandu de namji na shi tsoa de umara. Yawa de rangshin ki suke yoguyo na, gyutu suku rangshin ki rangwine suke yoguyo na, titu yogoro ti yogume doa se. Ikande re se gora tanda. Iko tokpe wangi, gyujin changwa ti rangshin ki maare, tenchen rebar jo ne, dine samla tancho da pacho da kanga nyamdun re ne, ine tewa di ki yoro mato. Kora rangshin ki rangwine su tewa yense, kadu yina tewa ki yasire tunge yense, kadu yina tunge kyude, tunge ki yase yo marwa. Oti sungora. 네, 내가 양의 동서라세. 근데 심소지대 감매시에세. 이라고도 저쪽이라. 랑원의 주변에 랑원의 주변 주단계를 때문에 그때와 연구에는 때도 여고로 와서 주진 남준에 산대 여러 봐서거라. 어떻게 làm 뛰어 마셔로 가디. 시간이 들람네 다르.
So here they're continuing into the second half of 88. Again, it is the case that our feelings are dependent, contingent upon, they're only something that arise in relation. So here it continues saying, if happiness truly exists, why do savory things and so on not brighten up the pain of grief and so on? So if you imagine like when a child has died, when someone is experiencing incredible grief and misery, you could make efforts to make them happiness, the normal things that would make somebody happy, like giving them delicious food and really sort of nice, soft clothing and so forth. Those we know, though, from experience, are not able to make someone happy who is, say, in the throes of grief. If it were the case that it were that happiness were existent from the side of the object, say, we should have, when we have all those kinds of conducive conditions for happiness, it should be guaranteed. Like if it's the case that that object brings happiness, well, then whenever that object is in proximity, you would have to experience pleasure. Like we know, though, from our own experience, when you are, say, having grief over someone who has died, a loved one who has died, even though you might see like really beautiful, someone that you really like comes along, or you see a really beautiful garden, or you have some delicious food that always brings you joy. When you are in the state of grief, none of those things have the ability to bring joy, to bring the kind of pleasure that they did. But it's rather, when we analyze, well, why is it that such things can't bring joy? It's because they don't exist, that sort of pleasure or joy doesn't exist in the object, but rather is dependent upon our mentally labeling of it, our own mental state.
Topdan dembe sine chi lenja yora, rawa du chuba ke lenge chubi. Adi, ya tadi, topdan dembe sine chi, rawa. Tadi tunge di topdan demba sonza, tegi tewa di pa siji nengi yore sere. Yoya yore de, te siji nengi pa nguen chubi yoma re si gora. Nyong tubi yoma re si, yoya yore si gora. Topdan dembe siji nembe chi na, sine chi re si. Kete tenyo mayi na se, o te tunge tawa de nyong tokuyo ma re se, tawa de siji nani ya shu chitara che che, ni nyongyo ma re se wara. Shimbu soki tewe kyuti yoba hina ya se wara, ito ni nyange ye ko, tungbe tu sonza ko, tunge de top chitara che ne, o teke pa siji nani ne, tawa de nyong tokuyo ma re se wara, nyong ma ina. Yeah.
So here then, in response to that, like in the second half of verse 86, where it said, if happiness truly exists, why do savory things and so on not brighten up the pain of grief and so on? And so the response that comes in the first half of 89 is that you may say such pleasure is not experienced due to its being overridden by intense suffering. So here they try to give the example of like, well, when you are in the throes of really intense grief, when you are experiencing that kind of intense suffering, it overrides that feeling of pleasure that one would get from those various objects. And so you can't experience the pleasure because of the fact that your suffering is so intense. So we're not able to feel that.
This one. Oh, yeah, okay. What did it? Oh, that is all this year. The young Jalaguera. She Yamyo Tani Min, then that's so much there is. The other yo, the Tungesho Chedashun, the Sijin and Yong Tokyo Marechera, Yuji Ore, the Chera Chunjuji or the Yong Tokyo Marechera. So the way you're not going young, we don't get so much condition or this year. Kanshi, I should have. Kanshi Yamyo Tani Mi, then that's so much there is. It is not so the way you're not. The one young motor caress. Nyongja Maying Soaji Kavayo Maresgora. Kanshi Nyamyo Tani me, then at Soachi there is it. So there were Kiran you said it, so there were Chitari de Maibar, you rig my dos. So there were in it, the one younger was it. The one young gummy to us. Oh, this is Gora. Yeah, teach Lapsana.
So then, continuing in response to that sort of back and forth, so when the other party says, you may say that such pleasure is not experienced to its being overridden by intense suffering, then the second half of verse 89 reads, how then can something that is not experienced be a feeling? So here they're trying to say, well, okay, when you are experiencing really intense suffering, even if you meet the kind of causes of pleasure, those objects that do give pleasure for them, again, autonomously or inherently, it's just the case that that suffering is so intense, it overrides the kind of happiness that you would experience. And so the response is that, well, how is something that is not experienced a feeling? If we don't experience something, we can't really call it a feeling. How can you say happiness is there if you don't feel it?
Oh, dear God, Nyamyo Tani me, then that's Soachi there is. So I never know it and you chikura. So I know it and you know Chikura. You tell a man, you never saw a radio mara. Doing a Nayo Bakasa. So I know it and you just much what the Nagudo. So I know it and you. So I said, so losing la pembe, so you know sooner. So I tell us Sigora. So losing la neve, so you to Yonguton, so I to Messigora. Yeah, you know, so such in Yongu, the mother, Manu, Devachi Omara. To do tell you, na. Chichukarin and Yongu, the mother, no, my. So I tell you, Umari. So I tell you, Nako, no, a Spanish quarter, to me, and no, a Spanish quarter. Oh, this is the. God, so. Kanshi Nyamyo Tangi Min, you're not so much there is. What did so I to do that seeking you're the young to be over the Digmaris. No, take a resna. Young Jamai get so much your Maris. This and Dimas, Lapsara. Yeah, what is so.
So then, again, where it says that how can something that is not experienced be a feeling? Feeling has the nature of experience. This is described in the Abhidharma literature, that as well as in things like entry to the middle way, a feeling of happiness is when we think that something is going to benefit our body and mind. That is happy. That is what we experience as pleasure. And that which we experience as suffering is what we perceive as harmful to body or mind. And so in the absence of that experience, how can we speak of a feeling? And it's not actually possible to talk of a feeling in the absence of experience, because feeling has the nature of experience. So that's, again, the second half of verse 89.
Thì đương nhiên phải có sự trải nghiệm về cảm thọ đó. Cho nên nếu như mà nó chưa được cảm nghiệm thì làm sao gọi nó là thọ được. Thọ là giống như cái cảm thọ được. Tại vì có cái này thì phải có cái kia. Có cái đối tượng được cảm nghiệm thì phải có chủ thể cảm nghiệm nó. Và trong khi nói khi có lạc mà không có cái tâm để cảm thọ cái niềm lạc đó thì sẽ không đúng.
동해 참모 됐어. 동해 참모 니도 예. 네. 나도 상고 뭐 이거 대주가 와래서 일도서 다시 땅이 땅에 매트 제 뒤집어서 겨겨서 겨겨서 어디래. 동해 참모 니도 예. 동해 참모 니도 예. 대라고 세미남세. Nên thế là xem gã chấm xem na thay nhẹ thế cái gì, ở đó. Chúng ta tham muốn nhiều hơn sẽ, ở đây ta thấy được sao thì, giáo thì nhung cái họ mà thế, chúng ta suy xét bất chợt ra, nhưng được có thì, để rằng xử lý ông thôi họ mà thế, chúng ta tham muốn cái ngõ xử lý nhung cái họ để xem nào sẽ mà rồi thì sao ra, chúng ta tham muốn nhiều hơn. Thế rakba xem nam thế cái đó rakba thì xem mà rồi sẽ ông ấy súc chim bây giờ xem nó có mấy số là sự đó xem cái này mấy cái đó thì ông ấy tham gia ngồi cái đó xem cái đó sẽ cái này thế là xem cái trong xem na thay như thế này thế này thế là xem cái trong giáo thế là 벌써 동해들의 셴버섬 예세나 찬예때야 셴나 찬예때야 돼서 어디서로 그때 좀대 개베스서 와라 내 소아 동해등이 영화 소아 등이도 여반여에 뭐래 마녀와 마녀는 진용용교하래서 영화에 대해서 소동에 참여하나 제톱도 대바되게 동해라 네바 시시체네서 야와 tom대 되게 동해를 네바 챤고 동해대 소속 말처럼 동해 숙천부에는 야와대 소속 말했어라 야와 tom대 영화를 줘서 근데 tom대 동해 에 라고서 하래 대톱도 대바되게 라고대 동해 라고 봤어요, 네. 동해 라고 매우 차고로. 동해 참으시네, 참으던 용고로. 마녀네 동해 신용해요 말아. 이번도라 동해 참으더니 여와 친구들에 생가 참으 노래. 나디스도 그소리. 동해 디 라고 세워면 남세. 와. 그 임벌 달라스. 동해 참모 때문에 대화 전부 때래 셴가 참모 좀 인도시나스 어레 동해 참모 때문에 대화 전부 때래 셴 가와 참모 좀 인도세 가와 참모 지여세 동해디 왜매세 가와 참모 지여버데 참모 지여래세라 동해디 여러게 소리셔도라 대화 차원이 돼야 대회 생일에 맞아. 또 참모인의 대화로 와네. 대화 연구로 하셔. 대화 참모인의 대화 연구로 하셔. 다 되시다. 소화 대화 연구들이 숙제부되게 동해 매를 동해 참모지요래서. 근데 딜레 셴베 tramu sambi no shenas. Dewa tramu tele sembe, kawa tramu, tunge de yebe kapdilia, dewa tramu sambre se. Dewa tramu ni dewe sengi. Dewa tramu yene an dewe sengi yin guruwa titu, dewa tramu chiyo na ya. Dewa tramu ti yongu re sikidwa. Sikidwa.
No.
Ya.
Câu về chương 90 thì trả lời rằng
So
là
then here, this gets a little confusing, but in verse 90 then, again, trying to sort of respond to the way in which these feelings work, it says, you may maintain that there is subtle unhappiness when there is great delight. And while gross misery is removed, you may believe that subtle discontent is simply another pleasure. If that were the case, then even that subtle satisfaction would be joy. So here, what is being explained is that when it comes to what they're saying about sort of pleasure and suffering either being experienced or not, they would say that, when something is gone into a sort of subtle state, it's not experienced. So when that kind of, for example, gross misery is removed, but this sort of subtle discontent remains, then that would actually have to be identified as another kind of pleasure, that sort of subtle suffering. So again, if it is the case that rather than saying one sort of prevents another or overrides another such that it can't be experienced, they're trying to say that, well, when we remove like gross unhappiness or misery, there's just something that's more subtle left. But if that's the kind of argument that one is trying to make, then that would end up meaning that that kind of subtle suffering that comes from that sort of remains at the time of even like great pleasure would have to be another form of joy, which doesn't make any sort of sense, because even sort of subtle pleasure is pleasure and subtle suffering is suffering. So here, to try to make the argument that when that sort of coarser form is removed, that we could posit that as being sort of displacing joy and pleasure. And so it's not as though like when we have removed our gross kind of suffering and only a subtle sort of suffering remains, that allows for us to say experience pleasure, well then that subtle kind of suffering itself would have to be considered a form of pleasure, which contradicts that kind of the contradiction between suffering and pleasure.
Jadi dewa tomden kebetse soa 동해 tramunito yaba nyoe 중세자 마녀와 예노시나스 어디도 자고 대치벌 파자야 되셔 소아 동해 tramu 여나 dewa tomden 디 동해에 너가 지시잖아 어레 소아 동해 tramu 쑥 소아 동해 tramu 여나 난다 동해 tramu도 대대 여나 시거라 dewa 쑥 첨부 예배 걸로 동해 tramu 대대 여나 니께 tomden 대화 tomden 되게 동해를 내가 마셔로 안때대 도와시거라 지시전에 대또는 된바 녀라 tomden 녀어 조스 대또는 된베 동해 디 라바 샤워 메남데스 동해 라바데 샤워로 동해 샤나 샤차로 메로 야 참무치 되어서 되게 말아 동해 참무되니 대화 전부 때래 셴가 tua 알았어. 동해 디 라바 잠세와 미남 예버라 돌아 동해 참모 때네 대화 첨부 때래 셴가 참모 잠예노 셴나스 오 다데스라 동해 참모 때네서라 대화 첨부 때래 셴가 가와 참모 예사 다데 도시 동해 참모 지와레 데데 가르소라 네 대화 참모치 ngoli 세르시도 동해 참모 때네 대화 첨부 때래 셴 네 가와 참모 잠예노 셴나 대화 차와니 대야 대화대 생일에 마대베 대화 참모예나 대화 연구에서 이제 동해를 말해 대화를 그래 동해 가서 참모예나 동해를 대화를 봐 sempre 아 대비고 시사 세브라 맞춰서
So here, this gets a little bit confusing, but again, it comes back to this idea of that so here, the kind of idea that was being responded to is that pleasure, like in the case of really intense grief, pleasure is not experienced being due to its being overridden by intense suffering. And so here, the kind of idea that we respond with is, how could something that is not experienced be a feeling? But then you maintain that there is subtle unhappiness when there is great delight. And so while gross misery is removed, like say for example, when we aren't experiencing something that is like gross misery, that when that is removed, there's a sort of subtle misery that remains that is would then have to be another kind of pleasure, because it is suffering that sort of is counteracted by happiness. And so if that were the case, then even that subtle dissatisfaction would be joy. That kind of subtle suffering or unhappiness that remains would then have to be identified as this subtle joy. And so that's problematic, because whether sort of subtle or gross, joy is joy, or happiness is happiness, and suffering is suffering. So having some sort of subtle suffering or dissatisfaction count as pleasure, that's contradictory. But that has to be in the nature of being happiness.
네메 보다 라주던 저와 남네 네메 보다 라주던 저와 남네 유르에 최전데스 네메베 타네 네임 보다스 라주 유르에 타네 개보다 네메도 라주다 저와 유르에 타네 그보다 와 요한네 담아치와 대장 신기 춘일이에서 고통에 대한데 연구와 현대야 고 대통에 연대 동에 연구를 지당 로서를 삼고 동에라체 양제 마트 송도와 최대 로전 연계치나 다들 고해랑 시대 이 담아 참말이야 지래 길엔 나와요 말에 다들 탈거나 과거한테 빵구를 마도 네 강가리야 지래 네 뒤랑시를 삼 너의 매버들와 내가 과거지는 거 다들 너 고위네 과래 탈거 자고 삼사 근데 삼을 건데 강춘중 도에게 없이 제고 있어라 마도 뒤동에 양구를 양제 대지 말해 시계번을 지은것도 와 개부지제로 럼부지제 당에메 좀으로 봐 근데 그 철이야 날 타이 겸줄 판도도 아니 전안에 봐 내가 겐게 두신 내가 겐게 랩체 아니 개부도 가가 두신 구실로 주체 Ani ti lumbu de lam a ta jebu de pe lumbu mi mambu le pendo yore. Ani ti tron na dig me do singa kera zo ti singa be chomche ma yogu is. Kera zo da ko me ma yero che. Ti saere ti de be kez me do. Oh tene. Ani lumbu de jebu lam che ta nga shi gi is kera be tron de petrol ades. Ni kera pa chi ni nge na mi sul ta ro shi chera. Uti cheren ke kondu nangmi tsu kanga pukudang pama tsu kodoga. E kondu pe simde chete yusara. Tabe baba china chumche lam mima ito tsu saji ti cheres. Ne chen kebu tsu le ne. Kebu ke ta jinde tinde chung sosi. Kinzo baba pe kati chibu yusche. Kondu le nyamba mambu tedwa. Kebu keshi ne pe mambu tedwa. 근데 가부 총세래 잡아와 좀데 야부 총소사 가와제래 저량 저자고 또서 야부 처네 야파 회계세라고 가셨더라 좋은데 두부 총스데 다시 자데 야부 총사 추부 차서로 근데 야 용기 어라지 삼을 동절에 개와야 거랑 신주로지 요 말아 되지람나 나 가와니
So here this like again, what is being talked about here in terms of there being a sort of nature of suffering, it's not the case that really we need to make an effort to reduce our attachment to these various things. Again, that's sort of nature, the way that we are, as the Buddha has described. All of these things that we might be attached to, like our state of health, our youth, our wealth, our life, all of these things are in the nature of change. They are not going to remain. It is the case that eventually we are going to get sick. We are going to age. Our wealth will decline. We are going to have to die. And so if we recognize that this is the nature of samsara, we won't get quite so distressed when these things happen. They happen to everyone. And so really, instead of trying to avert those kinds of temporary sufferings that befall us, we should look at, well, what is the cause of all of these sufferings? How do I get rid of the very root of this? And so here, we also can't necessarily be sure what will cause suffering and what will cause happiness. There was supposedly a long time ago, a king, and he was sort of like walking along the ocean when all of a sudden a ship came up and it had some kind of enemies on it, and they wanted to take this king away. They wanted to capture him. One of his ministers said, no, 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 you need to stay. You need to be here to lead and take care of the people. I will go instead. I will be taken instead. And so he was taken and killed, by this warring faction of humans or non-humans. And when then the king went to tell this man's family, he explained that your father has died in this kind of situation, but gave them all of these gifts in order to sort of repay for their father's death. So the kids thought this was pretty great, even though their father had died. They get all of these gifts and ministrations. So here nothing is really certain what, although there will necessarily be change, the kind of things that we hold on to, like our state of health, our youth, our wealth, even our life, these are all things that are subject to change. And if we can reduce our kind of attachment to them, this will greatly reduce the kind of suffering that we experience. So we're out of time, and we'll stop here.
So this session will end here today. Then tomorrow we have no class. In Sunday we have a special ceremony blessing and Geshe-la's blessing in Dochinamjom purification, and then also Geshe-la will teach how to practice Buddhism in daily life. And then next Thursday we have another session. That will be, we already email, so check your emails. and then Geshe will be available here for next week. If anybody would like to have him for blessing or something, you're most welcome. Okay. Yes.
Dạ, Richie nói là cái buổi học của chúng ta bữa nay đến đây là chấm dứt. Ngày mai thì chúng ta sẽ không có lớp học và chúng ta sẽ được nghỉ. Đến Chủ nhật thì mình sẽ có một cái buổi lễ tẩy tịnh có tên là Doji Nam Chom và Geshe-la Loseling Chopel sẽ dạy cho chúng ta cách làm sao để áp dụng cái Phật pháp trong cái đời sống hàng ngày. Rồi đến thứ năm tuần sau thì chúng ta sẽ có lớp và trong cái tuần sắp tới thì Geshe-la có sẵn sàng để mà chúc phúc hoặc là ban những cái gia hộ cho những cái vị nào mà quý vị có cần có được cầu an cầu siêu cho gia đình bạn bè hay là người thân, hay là muốn Geshe-la cầu nguyện dùm thì Geshe-la sẽ cầu nguyện cho quý vị. Và nếu mà quý vị có muốn ủng hộ hỗ trợ cho các học trò của Geshe-la ở bên Ấn Độ thì cũng có thể phụ giúp cho Geshe-la.
Okay. Mandala offering switch
Một trang
43.
43. Xin mời bác ạ, xin mời bác với lại chị Phương Hiếu với lại gia đình Michael, Michelle and Ryan. Ryan will be last. Yeah.
Ishingam bewa isho om benzam bume aho.